The battle was over. The once mighty Zorvathian warlord, Supreme Commander Zyvar, lay dead at Captain Daniel Graves' feet. His towering, reptilian frame twitched one last time before going still, his silver blood pooling on the cracked, alien battlefield. The human forces erupted into victorious cheers. The war against the Zorvathian Empire had raged for years, and now, with their leader dead, the war was effectively over. Daniel, still catching his breath, wiped the alien blood from his blade. He hadn't meant to kill Zyvar in single combat. It was supposed to be a last-ditch effort to buy his troops time, but somehow he had won, and now humanity had triumphed. A low hum filled the air, and a group of Zorvathian nobles emerged from the shadows. Their regal, golden-scaled robes shimmered under the dim twin suns of their homeworld. Their expressions weren't ones of rage or grief, as Daniel had expected. Instead, they looked satisfied. One of them, an elder with deep blue markings across his face, stepped forward. By the laws of the Zorvathian Empire, he announced in a guttural tone, "You are now the rightful ruler of our people." Daniel blinked. "Wait, what?" A younger Zorvathian, a female with piercing violet eyes, continued, "And as per tradition, you are obligated to take the previous ruler's wives as your own." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" The nobles bowed their heads in unison, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "It is the way of our people," the elder explained. "By slaying the Supreme Commander, you have proven yourself the stronger warrior. Leadership and its responsibilities are now yours." Daniel looked around, half expecting his troops to burst into laughter at this bizarre twist of fate. But the human soldiers were just as bewildered as he was. "Look, I don't want to be rude, but I came here to end the war, not marry alien women," Daniel said, rubbing his temples. The violet-eyed Zorvathian stepped closer. "Do you reject our sacred customs? Would you insult the legacy of our people?" Her tone was sharp, but her expression held something else. "Curiosity, perhaps?" "Listen," Daniel sighed, choosing his words carefully. "Humans don't exactly operate like this. I'm not interested in forcing anyone into." "You misunderstand," the elder interrupted. "The Supreme Commander's wives are not captives. They were chosen from noble houses, trained to guide the ruler and ensure stability in leadership. If you refuse them, it will be seen as an insult, an act of dishonor. It could shatter the fragile peace you have just won." Daniel's gut twisted. Peace was his priority. If rejecting this so-called tradition meant reigniting hostilities, he had a serious problem. Then, as if things weren't already insane enough, 3 figures stepped forward from the noble ranks. 3 Zorvathian women, each unique, each watching him with an unreadable expression. The first was tall and imposing, her golden scales polished to a near mirror-like sheen. Her stance was rigid, disciplined. A warrior. The second had a more calculating look, her darker green scales dull but her eyes sharp. A strategist. The third. She was the smallest of them, with a gracefulness that suggested she was more of a diplomat than a fighter. Daniel swallowed hard. He had defeated the alien warlord, saved humanity, and won the war. Now, he had to deal with the consequences, and apparently that meant having 3 alien wives. Daniel felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him, human and alien alike. The Zorvathian noble stood expectantly, as if his acceptance was a mere formality. His soldiers, on the other hand, looked torn between amusement and concern. Sergeant Reynolds, his second-in-command, leaned in with a smirk. "Well, Captain, I think this is what they call a diplomatic nightmare." Daniel shot him a glare. Not helping, Reynolds, the warrior wife, the tallest of the 3, stepped forward first. Her stance was firm, her expression unreadable. "I am Vera," she said, her voice steady but edged with something close to defiance. "I was the Supreme Commander's first wife. I am a warrior like you. If you accept this responsibility, you will not find me weak." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "This isn't about strength. I don't even know what this responsibility is. The second wife stepped forward, her gaze calculating. I am Sereth. I advise Zyvar in matters of war and politics. Our traditions exist for a reason. Stability is paramount. If you reject this bond, the Empire will see it as a rejection of peace. Daniel exhaled slowly. You're telling me that after years of war, your people are willing to throw everything away because I don't want an alien marriage. Sarah tilted her head. It is not about want. It is about duty. The third, the smallest of them, approached next. She moved with deliberate grace, her dark violet eyes studying him. I am Kyra, she said softly. I handle diplomacy and relations with the other noble houses. I understand that your kind does not share our ways, but rejecting this would be unwise. Daniel rubbed his face. So, what? You three were just waiting around to be handed off to whoever killed your husband. Vera's eyes flashed with anger, but it was Kyra who answered. We were not his property, nor are we now yours. She stepped even closer, her voice dropping low. But the Zorvathian people need a leader. Without one, factions will rise, warlords will fight for control, and the bloodshed will begin anew. The transition must be smooth, and that means adhering to tradition. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had fought tooth and nail to end this war, not become part of an alien political system. But if rejecting their custom meant plunging the galaxy into chaos, what choice did he have? I can't just agree to this blindly, he said. There has to be another way. Saratha's expression was unreadable. If you wish to refuse, you will need to defeat every warlord who claims the throne. One by one, Daniel's stomach dropped. He was exhausted. His men were exhausted. More fighting wasn't an option. Reynolds whistled under his breath. Hell of a situation, sir. Daniel let out a long sigh. He had won the war. Now, it seemed he had to win the peace. Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose, willing away the pounding headache forming behind his eyes. This was absurd. He had expected political negotiations, treaties, maybe a few tense standoffs in the aftermath of Zyvar's death. But this? So, just to be clear, he said, looking between the three women, if I refuse, we're looking at an all-out civil war. Vera crossed her arms. Correct. The noble houses will see the throne as unclaimed, and they will fight for it. Blood will flood the streets. The Empire will fracture, and your people will not be spared from the chaos. Sareth nodded. The war did not end when Zyvar fell. You simply won the right to determine what happens next. Daniel cursed under his breath. He had risked everything to ensure peace. But if that peace hinged on this insane tradition, what was he supposed to do? Reynolds, still far too entertained by the situation, leaned in again. You know, Captain, I'd say you got a raw deal, but 3 wives? Could be worse. Daniel shot him a look. Say that again, and you're staying here with me. Reynolds held up his hands in mock surrender. Daniel turned back to the women. All right, let's say I do go along with this. What does that actually mean? What's expected of me? Saratha's lips curled in the faintest hint of a smirk. The Empire needs a ruler, not merely a figurehead. You would take Zyvar's place, lead his armies, govern his people, and ensure stability. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. Great. So, instead of going home, I get a full-time job ruling an alien empire. Anything else? Kyra spoke next, her voice measured. The bond between ruler and his wives is more than symbolic. We are your advisors, your confidants, your link to the noble houses. This is not a mere political gesture. It is a commitment. Vera's eyes narrowed. And if you take it lightly, you will be challenged. The nobles will test you. The warlords will seek your death. You must prove your strength again and again. Daniel groaned. Of course I do. The weight of the decision settled on him like a lead blanket. There had to be another way. A loophole, an alternative. But staring at the 3 women, each powerful in her own right, each bound by a duty just as heavy as his, He realized that even if there was another way, it would come at a cost. Peace was fragile. If this was what it took to hold it together, he exhaled sharply. Fine, he muttered. I'll do it. Kyra studied him carefully. You accept the responsibility. Daniel clenched his jaw. I accept. The nobles erupted into cheers, raising their hands in salute. The war was over. Now his reign had begun. The cheers of the nobles echoed through the great hall, but Daniel felt no triumph. His gut twisted as the reality of what he'd just agreed to settled in. He had spent years fighting the Zorvathians, pushing back against their brutal conquest, only to now find himself at the head of their empire. Vera, Sereth, and Kyra watched him closely, each with unreadable expressions. He wasn't sure if they approved of his decision, or if they were simply relieved he hadn't chosen the alternative, endless war. Reynolds leaned in again, voice low. So, do we call you Ember Graves now? Daniel shot him a glare. Not funny. I wasn't joking. Before Daniel could respond, the elder noble who had first spoken stepped forward. It is done, he declared. You have accepted the burden of leadership and with it, the bond of the Supreme Commander's wives. The Empire will remain whole. Daniel clenched his fists. He had fought for peace, and now he had to lead for it. All right, he said, his voice firm. If I'm in charge now, I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with. I want a full report on the state of the Empire. Territories, military forces, economic conditions, political threats, everything. Sereth inclined her head slightly. A wise decision. We will arrange a full briefing. Vera stepped forward. You will also need to make a public appearance. The warlords and noble houses will want to see you. They need to know you are not a pretender. Daniel exhaled. And if they don't like what they see, then they will challenge you, Vera said bluntly. Daniel grimaced. Of course they will. Kyra, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. You are human. That alone makes you an anomaly. Some will see you as a conqueror, others as a necessary evil. Many will plot against you. Her eyes locked onto his. You cannot afford to be careless. Daniel met her gaze. I don't intend to be. The elder noble stepped forward again. Come. The transition ceremony must be completed. The people must see their new ruler. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wanted to protest, to insist he needed time to think, but he knew there was no time. If he hesitated now, if he looked weak, it would only embolden his enemies. He glanced at his soldiers, who still stood at attention, waiting for orders. Reynolds, get our people settled. Keep everyone on high alert. We don't know how stable things really are. Reynolds nodded. You got it, Captain. Daniel turned back to the three women who were now, by some twisted alien law, his wives. All right, he said, forcing steel into his voice. Let's get this over with. Kyra gave him a knowing smile. Your reign begins now, Supreme Commander. Daniel had won the war. Now, he had to survive the peace. Daniel stood at the edge of the massive ceremonial platform, looking out over a sea of Zorvathians. The great capital city of Zyvar's empire stretched far into the horizon. Massive black stone structures, banners of deep crimson bearing the former warlord's crest, and towering statues of past rulers. The crowd, a mix of warriors, nobles, and civilians, watched him with unreadable expressions, some with awe, others with suspicion. This was the moment that would decide everything. Sarah stood at his side, speaking low so only he could hear. They expect strength. If they sense hesitation, they will see you as weak. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had spent his life as a soldier, fighting for survival, leading men into battle. But this was different. He wasn't just here to win. He was here to rule. The elder noble from earlier raised his arms, silencing the murmuring crowd. The Supreme Commander Zyvar has fallen in battle, and by the sacred law of our people, the victor shall take his place. A rumble spread through the assembled Zorvathians. Daniel couldn't tell if it was approval or unease. Daniel Graves, warrior of humanity, has proven himself in combat. The elder continued. He has accepted the sacred duty of leadership, and with it, the bond of the Supreme Commander's wives. Daniel's shoulders tensed as Vera, Sereth, and Kyra stepped forward. This moment was symbolic, meant to solidify his claim. His mind still reeled at the absurdity of it, but he forced himself to stay composed. Vera, ever the warrior, placed a fist over her chest. By tradition, I swear loyalty to the Supreme Commander. I will fight by his side and ensure his rule is one of strength. Saratha's voice was calmer, more calculating. I will be his counsel, his strategist. His mind shall not be without guidance. Kyra's gaze was sharp, yet her tone was smooth as silk. I will be his voice among the noble houses. I will see that his rule endures. The three women then turned toward the gathered crowd. The moment stretched, tension thick in the air. Then a roar erupted, some voices raised in triumph, others in outrage. Daniel knew what this meant. The empire was divided. Some would accept him, others would fight against him. The elder turned to face him. You must speak. You must show them you are worthy. Daniel took a slow breath and stepped forward. His voice rang out across the platform. I did not come here to rule you. I came here to end a war. And now, I stand before you, not as a conqueror, but as the one who will keep what we fought for from being undone. His gaze swept over the crowd. If you challenge me, know this, I will not falter. If you stand with me, I will ensure this empire does not fall into ruin. The war is over. Now, we build something stronger. Silence. Then, the warriors began to chant his name. Others still looked wary. The true battle had only just begun. As the chants of his name echoed through the capital, Daniel remained standing tall, even as uncertainty churned in his gut. The war had ended with a single strike of his blade, but securing peace would be a far more delicate, treacherous task. Vera, Sereth, and Kyra stood at his side, their expressions unreadable. He wasn't sure if they approved of his speech or if they were merely waiting to see how the people would react. Either way, he had no choice but to push forward. The elder noble turned back to the crowd, raising his arms once more. It is done. The Supreme Commander has spoken. Let those who stand with him strengthen the empire, and those who oppose him, his voice turned sharp, fall in disgrace. Daniel narrowed his eyes. Subtle, the old man clearly wasn't leaving room for neutrality. You were either with the new ruler or against him. That meant there would be challenges ahead. As the ceremony concluded, a procession of armored guards stepped forward, motioning for Daniel and his wives to follow. He shot a quick glance at Reynolds, who was lingering just outside the ceremonial space with the other human soldiers. You good here? Reynolds mouthed. Daniel gave him a slight nod, though he wasn't sure how true it was. Then he followed the procession through the massive archways leading into the Supreme Commander's stronghold. Inside, the palace was unlike anything Daniel had seen before. High vaulted ceilings, walls lined with banners from conquered worlds, and towering statues of past rulers. The air smelled of incense and burning metal, a strange mix of the sacred and the industrial. Vera walked beside him, her stride long and purposeful. Your first test will come soon. Daniel gave her a sidelong glance. That's so. She nodded. Many warlords will want to challenge your claim. Some will attempt open combat. Others will seek more subtle ways to remove you. Sereth folded her arms. We must consolidate power quickly. The longer you wait, the more opportunities your enemies will have to strike. Daniel let out a slow breath. You're saying I should expect assassination attempts. Kyra gave him a small, almost amused smile. It would be more surprising if there weren't any. Great. Just great. As they entered what looked like a war room, its massive central table covered in holographic displays of various star systems, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Winning the war had been the easy part. Now he had to play the deadliest game of all, politics. And the first move had to be his. Daniel sat at the massive war table, his fingers drumming against the cold metal surface as he studied the holographic display of the Zorvathian Empire. Dozens of star systems, each controlled by warlords, noble houses, or former generals of Zyvar. Some had already pledged loyalty, but others would be a problem. Vera, standing to his right, was scanning a list of high-ranking military leaders. Several warlords have sent their formal acknowledgments of your rule, she said. Some out of loyalty, others out of fear. She tapped a name on the display, but others see an opportunity in your unusual position. Daniel leaned in. What kind of opportunity? Sareth folded her arms. To take the throne for themselves? Kyra, seated elegantly across from him, let out a soft sigh. Zyvar's rule was built on power and intimidation. He crushed rebellion with overwhelming force. You, on the other hand, are an unknown variable. You're human, and that alone makes you suspect in their eyes. She tilted her head. They will test you. Daniel exhaled sharply. Let me guess. Someone's already making a move. Sareth nodded. Warlord Kork of the Jator system. He's issued a formal challenge to your rule. Vera's lips curled into a smirk. It was expected. Kork was one of Zyvar's fiercest rivals. Kept in check only because he feared him. Now that Zyvar is dead, he thinks he has a chance to seize the throne. Daniel clenched his jaw. And this formal challenge. What does that actually mean? Vera's eyes gleamed. Single combat. Daniel blinked. You're joking. Sareth shook her head. It is tradition. If a warlord challenges the Supreme Commander's rule, they must face them in a duel. If they win, they take control. Daniel exhaled slowly. This was ridiculous. He had thought politics would involve backroom deals and subtle betrayals, not little fights to the death. Kyra studied him carefully. You won against Zyvar, but do not underestimate Kork. He has trained for war his entire life. He will not be an easy opponent. Daniel rubbed his temples. And if I refuse? Vera chuckled darkly. Then every warlord who doubts you will see it as weakness. And instead of one duel, you'll have open rebellion. Fantastic. Daniel leaned back in his chair. All right. Where and when? Sareth brought up a hologram of a circular combat arena. The ritual duel will take place at the Colosseum of the Fallen, Zyvar's old proving grounds. It will be publicly broadcasted across the Empire. Kyra smiled slightly. All eyes will be on you. If you win, you solidify your rule. If you lose... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Daniel exhaled sharply. Fine. I'll fight him. Vera grinned. Good. Because he won't go easy on you. Daniel gave a humorless chuckle. Yeah. Well, neither will I. The first real challenge to his rule had arrived, and he intended to meet it head-on. The Colosseum of the Fallen was an ancient structure, its massive stone walls blackened from centuries of bloodshed. Carved deep into the heart of the Zorvathian capital, it was a place of spectacle, a battleground where warriors proved their worth or perished in disgrace. Daniel stood in the center of the vast arena, rolling his shoulders as the weight of a borrowed Zorvathian blade settled in his grip. The weapon was heavier than a human sword, its curved edges wickedly sharp. Around him, thousands of Zorvathians filled the stands, their reptilian faces twisted in anticipation. This wasn't just a duel. This was a test. High above, on an elevated platform, Vera, Sareth, and Kyra stood beside the noble houses, their expressions unreadable. His human soldiers, though vastly outnumbered, had taken positions near the arena's edge, watching closely. Across from Daniel, Warlord Kork stepped forward. The warlord was massive, even by Zorvathian standards. His golden scales gleamed in the harsh sunlight, his broad chest covered in ceremonial battle armor. His crimson eyes locked onto Daniel with pure disdain. So this is the human who dares call himself Supreme Commander, Kork sneered, his voice like grinding stone. You are no ruler. You are an accident. Daniel smirked. Funny, Zyvar said something similar before I put him down. Kork snarled, bearing jagged teeth. Zyvar was a fool, too blinded by his arrogance to see his own downfall. I will not make the same mistake. A deep horn sounded, its echo rolling through the Colosseum. The fight was about to begin. Daniel took a slow breath. He had faced plenty of enemies before, soldiers, mercenaries, alien warriors, but never in a setting like this. There was no battlefield, no cover, no strategy beyond pure combat skill. Korik grinned, flexing his clawed fingers around the hilt of his massive battle axe. I will make this quick, human. I want your people to see how fragile their leader truly is. Daniel smirked. Come and find out. The second horn blast signaled the start of the duel. Korik moved first, closing the distance in a blur of speed that shouldn't have been possible for a creature his size. He swung the battle axe in a deadly arc, the sheer force of it splitting the stone where Daniel had been standing a half-second earlier. Daniel twisted away, barely dodging the strike. He countered with a slash of his own, aiming for Korik's exposed side. The warlord deflected it with his armored forearm, sending sparks flying as the blades clashed. The crowd roared in approval. Korik grinned. You're fast, but that won't save you. He lashed out again, this time with a brutal kick. Daniel managed to block, but the impact sent him skidding back. The warlord was monstrously strong. One clean hit would end this fight. Daniel adjusted his stance. He couldn't match Korik in brute force. If he was going to win, he had to fight smart. Korik charged again, raising his axe for a devastating overhead strike. But Daniel had seen this kind of aggression before. Too much power, not enough control. At the last second, he sidestepped, twisting past the descending blade. Then he struck. His sword slashed across Korik's side, cutting through the warlord's armor and drawing dark blood. The crowd gasped. Korik staggered, but instead of retreating, he roared in fury and swung wildly. Daniel barely ducked in time as the axe whistled past his head. Lucky, Korik growled, clutching his wound. But luck runs out. Daniel didn't answer. He was too busy calculating his next move. He needed to end this before Korik adapted to his speed. Korik lunged again, but this time, Daniel didn't dodge. Instead, he feinted, baiting the warlord into a reckless swing. Korik took the bait, his axe arcing toward Daniel's side. At the last second, Daniel pivoted inside Korik's guard, and then he drove his sword straight into the warlord's gut. The blade sank deep. Korik froze, his crimson eyes wide with shock. Daniel twisted the sword and yanked it free. Korik dropped to his knees, clutching his wound, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The arena fell silent. Daniel stepped forward, standing over his fallen opponent, his grip tightened on his sword. In Zorvathian culture, these duels were to the death. The moment demanded an execution. But Daniel hesitated. Korik glared up at him, blood dripping from his mouth. Do it, human, he spat. Show them you have the strength to rule. Daniel exhaled. Then, in one swift motion, he flipped his sword and drove it down, but not into Korik's neck. Instead, he buried the blade into the stone beside the warlord. The message was clear. The crowd erupted in mixed reactions, some in outrage, others in awe. Daniel knelt, lowering his voice so only Korik could hear. I don't need to kill you to prove my strength, he said. You lost. That's enough. Korik stared at him, stunned. Then, after a long moment, he let out a weak, bitter laugh. Perhaps you are not an accident after all. He lowered his head in submission. Daniel stood, turning to face the watching nobles. He raised his blood-stained blade high. I won't rule through fear, he declared, his voice carrying across the Colosseum. I won't kill to prove myself. I won this fight, and I will win every fight to come, but not for power, not for tradition. I will win because this empire needs a leader who doesn't think with his blade. Silence. Then, one by one, the warriors in the crowd began to pound their fists against their chests in a show of respect. The sound grew, spreading through the arena until the entire Colosseum trembled with the force of it. Daniel had done more than win a duel. He had changed the game. The deafening rhythm of Zorvathian warriors pounding their chests still echoed in Daniel's ears as he left the Colosseum. The moment had been surreal. These were the same warriors who had once seen him as an enemy, the same nobles who had doubted his rule. Yet now they acknowledged him. Maybe not fully, not yet, but it was a start. Korik had been taken away to receive medical treatment, and though he had lost, Daniel knew the warlord's survival sent a different kind of message, one that could be far more powerful than a mere display of brute strength. He hadn't just won the duel. He had reshaped the rules of leadership. As he entered the Supreme Commander's war room, he was met with the expectant gazes of his 3 wives. Vera was the first to speak, her arms crossed over her armored chest. "You should have killed him." Daniel smirked, wiping Korik's blood from his blade before setting it down on the table. "If I had, I'd be just another warlord playing the same old game." Vera's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Sereth, always a strategist, studied him carefully. "What you did was dangerous, but effective." She exhaled. "You took a risk, and it paid off for now. But don't expect your enemies to follow your example." Daniel nodded. He knew mercy wouldn't always be an option. There would be battles ahead where he wouldn't have the luxury of sparing an enemy. But this had been the right move. Kyra stepped forward last, her violet eyes gleaming with something between admiration and amusement. "You didn't just win today," she said. "You changed how they see you, and more importantly, you changed how they see themselves." Daniel met her gaze. "That was the goal." She smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you truly are the leader this empire needs." Daniel let out a slow breath, glancing at the holographic map of the empire. There was still so much left to do. He had won the throne, but now he had to keep it. He had to rebuild what war had shattered, unite the factions that still teetered on the edge of rebellion, and somehow balance the demands of both his human soldiers and the Zorvathian people. Reynolds, who had been standing silently by the door, finally stepped forward. "Hell of a thing, Captain," he muttered. "Never thought I'd see the day where an entire alien empire cheers your name." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, well, neither did I." He looked back at the 3 women who were now, in some strange way, his partners in ruling this empire. They weren't just wives. They were warriors, advisors, and symbols of the fragile peace he was trying to forge. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be simple. But he had won battles against worse odds before. And if he had to fight for this empire's future, fight for a peace that could last, then so be it. Daniel Graves had won the war. Now, he was going to win the peace.